The three Apache sisters said to the farmer, "You're the first white man we've ever touched." The sun hung low over the dusty plains, casting long shadows across the small farm that John Miller had built with his own hands. The land was rough, dry, and unforgiving, but to John it was full of promise. Every morning he woke before the sun, his hands calloused and strong from years of hard work, tending to the small patch of crops he had managed to grow. He was a solitary man, not by choice but by circumstance. He had moved west to escape the crowded towns and the noise of the cities, seeking a life that was simpler, quieter, and honest. John had heard stories of this land before he arrived, tales of the vast deserts, the wild canyons, and the tribes who lived in harmony with the land for generations. He respected those stories, though he had never truly met anyone from the tribes. They were always figures in the background of history books or whispered legends told by travelers. To John, the land had always felt empty, silent in a way that both comforted and unnerved him. That is, until the day he saw the three sisters. It began as a normal morning. John had risen early, as he always did, and was working near the edge of his field, watering the crops and checking the soil. The wind carried the faint scent of sagebrush, dry and sharp, and the occasional cry of a distant hawk echoed across the plains. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and looked up at the horizon, where the rocky hills met the sky. It was then that he noticed them. Three figures moved slowly along the ridge of a nearby canyon, their movements cautious and deliberate. At first he thought they were travelers passing through, perhaps traders or wanderers. But as he squinted, he realized that they were much closer in age to children, or perhaps young teenagers. They moved in a quiet, fluid way, as if they were part of the land itself, blending with the colors of the rocks and the earth. John froze, unsure what to do. He had never expected to see anyone here, let alone three young girls moving silently through the desert. The girls stopped and watched him as well. Their eyes were wide and curious, filled with a mixture of wonder and caution. John could feel their gaze on him, and for a moment he felt a strange connection, an unspoken recognition that crossed the boundaries of language, culture, and experience. He lowered his watering can slowly, trying not to scare them away. He wanted to speak, to call out a greeting, but he knew they would not understand his words. Instead, he raised a hand in a gentle wave. The eldest sister tilted her head, studying him with careful eyes, and then, after a long moment, she waved back in a small, shy gesture. The other two sisters followed her lead, their hands lifting in unison. It was a simple exchange, but to John it felt monumental. Here were three young girls from a world he had never touched, never understood, and yet somehow they were reaching out, even in this small way, across the invisible barrier that separated their lives from his. John decided to approach slowly. He set down the watering can and took a few steps toward them, making sure his movements were calm and non-threatening. The sisters stepped back slightly, their bodies tense but their eyes still fixed on him. John stopped at a respectful distance and knelt down, bringing himself closer to their level without appearing aggressive. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of bread he had saved from breakfast. Holding it out in his hand, he offered it to them. For a moment, there was silence. The wind whispered through the canyon, and a lone bird cried somewhere in the distance. Then, the eldest sister took a hesitant step forward. Her fingers brushed against the bread lightly, and she looked back at her younger sisters. They too approached, each of them touching the bread with careful fingers. It was a simple act, but it carried weight far beyond what words could express. Trust, even the smallest spark of it, had begun to form.
As they accepted the bread, John noticed something that made his heart skip. One of the sisters reached out and touched his hand gently, almost reverently.
Brit. He looked into her eyes and she whispered something in a language he did not understand. He could not make out the words, but the tone, soft and curious, carried meaning. The eldest sister then used gestures, pointing between him and herself. And finally, the meaning became clear. They were telling him, in the only way they knew how, that he was the first white man they had ever touched. Brit. John felt a mixture of awe and humility wash over him. He had heard stories of encounters between settlers and tribes, of misunderstandings and fear, of hostility and conflict. But this moment was different. There was no anger, no threat, only curiosity and a tentative trust. The sisters had seen him as a stranger, a man from a world they had never known, and yet they had reached out. Their touch was a bridge between two lives, two cultures, and two histories that had rarely met in such a simple human way. The sun continued its slow climb across the sky, casting golden light over the desert. John stayed kneeling, watching the sisters with a mix of wonder and careful attention.
He wanted to communicate more, to tell them he meant no harm, to share his world with them as they had shared a piece of theirs with him, but he knew words would fail him.
Instead, he offered a small smile and nodded, hoping they would understand his intentions. The sisters lingered for a while, curious and cautious. They pointed to his crops, and John nodded, showing them how he had grown them, explaining without words, using gestures and simple signs. He demonstrated how he watered the plants, how he checked the soil, how he tended to the small sprouts that had begun to peek through the earth. The sisters watched intently, their eyes bright with fascination. They tried to mimic his movements, laughing quietly when they stumbled, and John felt a warmth in his chest. Here, in the middle of an unforgiving land, two worlds were meeting not through conflict or conquest, but through curiosity, learning, and the gentle spark of human connection. As the day wore on, John knew that this encounter would not last forever. The sisters were cautious, and their world was far different from his own. Yet he also knew that something had shifted. The desert, which had once seemed so empty, now felt alive with possibility. The presence of these three young girls had opened a door to understanding, and John felt a quiet determination to honor that trust. He packed up his tools and watched as the sisters slowly retreated toward the canyon, their eyes glancing back at him one last time. The words they had whispered in their language, the simple touch of their hands, the careful curiosity in their gaze, all of it lingered with him long after they disappeared from sight. He stood alone in his field, the wind carrying the faint sound of their laughter back to him, and he felt a deep sense of connection, one that transcended the boundaries of language, culture, and fear. That evening, as John sat by the small fire he had built near his cabin, he thought about the sisters. He wondered about their lives, their family, and the world they came from. He realized that this land, which he had sought for solitude and escape, was now a place of discovery, where the unexpected could arrive in the form of three young girls, whose trust had changed his life in a single moment. He understood that the story of this day, the story of the first touch between him and the sisters, was something that would remain with him forever, a reminder that human connection could flourish even in the most unlikely of places. As night fell and the stars began to scatter across the sky, John looked toward the canyon, imagining the sisters resting in their own home. He felt gratitude, hope, and a quiet excitement for what the coming days might bring. He knew this encounter was only the beginning, that the bond they had begun to form could grow if nurtured with patience and respect. And with that thought, he closed his eyes, letting the gentle desert night wrap around him, carrying with it the memory of three curious eyes, three gentle hands, and a moment of trust that bridged worlds. The next morning, John woke with the sunlight spilling over his cabin, painting the dusty floor in gold. The desert seemed different that day, somehow warmer and more alive. Brit. He could still feel the memory of the sisters' touch, their gentle hands brushing against his as they shared the bread. That single moment had left an impression on him that he could not shake. Brit. He rose early, as always, but this time he carried a small basket of fresh fruit and vegetables from his farm. He wasn't sure what he was going to do, but a quiet voice inside him said that he should prepare in case the sisters returned. Brit. He walked slowly to the edge of his field, the sun warming his back, and waited. The desert was silent except for the soft rustle of the wind through the sagebrush. Birds chirped in the distance, and somewhere a coyote's howl carried faintly across the plains. Hours passed, but John did not move. Brit. He simply watched the horizon, hoping, expecting, yet not demanding anything. He understood the sisters were cautious. Brit. They had every reason to be. This land had always been theirs long before settlers arrived. Brit. And now, here he was, a stranger with pale skin and an unfamiliar language, seeking friendship. It was mid-morning when he finally saw them. The three sisters appeared again, moving slowly along the ridge of the canyon. This time, they were less hesitant. Their eyes met his, and he noticed a subtle change. The eldest sister, who had first touched his hand, now held herself a little taller, more confident. The two younger sisters followed her lead, and their movements, though still cautious, seemed lighter, more curious than fearful. John waved gently and called out, using simple words, hoping some sound might bridge the gap between them. Brit. The sisters tilted their heads, listening, but made no sound in response. He laughed softly to himself, realizing that words alone would not carry their meaning. Brit. Instead, he knelt down again, showing that he meant no harm. From his basket he took out a piece of melon and held it out. Brit. The sisters hesitated for a moment, then, one by one, they accepted it, their small fingers brushing his hand again. This time the eldest sister smiled, a small shy smile that felt like sunlight breaking through clouds. Brit. John realized that smiles, gestures, and shared actions could communicate as much as language. He pointed to himself and said his name slowly. John. Brit. Miller. The eldest sister repeated after him in her own way, her lips moving carefully over the strange sounds. Brit. He nodded with encouragement, then pointed to her.
She said something in her language, and he could only guess it was her name.
Brit. He nodded again, feeling as if the first steps of understanding had been taken. Over the next several days, this ritual became routine. Brit. The sisters visited John at the same time each morning. He would prepare small gifts for them, simple things like pieces of fruit, dried meat, or fresh water. Brit. In return, they shared what they could, showing him small trinkets made from stones, feathers, and beads. Through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and mimed movements, they communicated stories of their lives. John learned that they lived nearby with their family, who had taught them to survive in the harsh desert. He learned about the games they played, the songs they sang, and the care they gave to one another. Brit. The sisters in turn began to understand more about John. They saw his dedication to the land, the way he tended each plant with patience and care. Brit. They noticed his kindness, the way he treated them with respect, never rushing or frightening them. Slowly, trust blossomed between them. Brit. One morning, the eldest sister brought a small clay bowl she had made herself. She placed it on the ground in front of John and smiled. Brit. He could tell it was a gift. He held it gently, turning it over in his hands, and nodded in gratitude. John realized that trust, once broken or withheld, was difficult to rebuild, but it could also grow in unexpected ways. These three young girls who had every reason to fear him had chosen to reach out. Brit. And he, in turn, chose to honor that trust, to meet them in their world without forcing his own upon them. He began to teach them small things about farming, showing them how to plant seeds in neat rows, how to water them evenly, and how to care for the soil. Brit. The sisters watched carefully, learning quickly, and sometimes laughing when they accidentally spilled water or tripped over a row of tiny sprouts. John also learned more about their world. Desperate patterns in their weaving and the delicate way they decorated small objects with stones and feathers. The sisters showed him how to find edible plants in the desert, pointing to bushes and roots and explaining, through gestures, what could be eaten and what could not. He marveled at their knowledge, realizing that this land which he had thought he understood held secrets that only those born into it could know. But it wasn't always easy. One day, as John worked near the edge of his field, he heard the faint sound of voices approaching. Some of the townspeople had come, curious about the newcomers in the area. They had heard of the sisters' visits and were suspicious. John saw their cautious faces as they looked toward the canyon, and he realized that his friendship with the sisters could be misunderstood. He hurried to meet them, waving his hands to indicate that everything was fine, but the sisters froze, unsure of what to do. John knelt beside them, speaking softly, and guided them behind a small hill for safety. Desperate. From this vantage point, the sisters watched the strangers, their small hands gripping the edges of the rocks. John explained to them, using gestures, that these people were not a threat if they stayed hidden. The sisters nodded slowly, their trust in John deepening as they realized he would protect them. The incident was a reminder of how fragile trust could be, yet it also strengthened the bond between them. Days turned into weeks, and the routine of their meetings continued. The sisters began to feel comfortable enough to sit closer to John, to mimic his actions with the crops, and to share more of themselves. They laughed more freely, their eyes shining with the joy of discovery. John, too, found a sense of companionship he had not known he needed. The farm, once a place of solitude, now felt alive with stories, laughter, and learning. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, John noticed the sisters lingering longer than usual. They pointed toward the canyon and then back at him, using gestures that suggested they wanted him to follow. Curious, he stood and carefully walked with them, keeping his movements slow and reassuring. They led him to a small, hidden stream, a place of quiet beauty, where the water reflected the colors of the sunset. John sat beside the sisters, letting the cool water run through his hands as they did the same. Simple as it was, carried more meaning than anything he had known before. Here was a connection, fragile yet real, built not on words or agreements, but on shared experience, patience, and trust. He felt honored to be allowed into their world even briefly, and he knew that these days were creating memories that would last a lifetime. As night fell, the sisters stood and began to lead him back to the farm. They paused, each of them touching his hands once more, a silent acknowledgement of the bond they had begun to form. John watched them disappear into the shadows of the canyon, feeling a deep sense of gratitude and wonder.
The desert was no longer a lonely place. It was a place of connection, of learning, and of trust, fragile yet enduring.
That night, John sat by the fire, thinking about the lessons he had learned. The sisters had taught him patience, the value of listening without words, and the importance of trust. They had shown him that friendship could cross boundaries, that kindness could be understood even without a shared language. And though he did not know what the future would bring, he felt certain of one thing. These three young sisters had changed his life, opening his heart to a world he had never known, and giving him a glimpse of the power of human connection in its purest form. The days passed like a gentle river, slow and steady, carrying John and the three sisters into a rhythm that neither of them had expected, but both had come to cherish. Morning after morning they met at the edge of his small farm, and their routine had become more than just a simple visit. It was a quiet ritual of trust, laughter, and learning. John had come to anticipate the sight of their figures moving gracefully along the canyon ridge, their eyes bright with curiosity, and the sisters had begun to greet him with gestures and smiles that felt almost like the beginning of a language only they could speak. Brit. John found himself becoming more patient than he had ever been. He watched the sisters as they explored his farm, asking questions through gestures and pointing. Brit. He taught them the names of the plants he grew, the ways to check the soil, and the importance of water. They listened intently, imitating his movements with careful attention. Brit. When they failed or stumbled, they laughed, and John laughed with them. The sound of their joy was infectious, lifting the heavy heat of the desert into something lighter, almost playful. Brit. He realized that these simple moments, small and unassuming, had begun to fill a space in his heart he had not known was empty. The sisters also began to teach John. Brit.
They showed him which plants in the desert could be eaten and which could be dangerous. They pointed to cacti and roots, miming the way they harvested them.
Brit. John was amazed at how much they knew, how they had learned to survive in a land that seemed so harsh and unforgiving. He realized that this knowledge had been passed down through generations, a deep understanding of the world that no book could teach. Brit. In return, he shared stories of the distant towns he had come from, describing the wide streets, the crowded markets, and the bustling life he had left behind. Brit. Though he could only explain through gestures and simple words, the sisters listened with fascination, their eyes wide, taking in everything with wonder.
One day, John decided to take their trust a step further.
Brit. He led them carefully to a section of his farm he had just planted, showing them how to dig small trenches for the seeds. He demonstrated each step slowly, letting them copy him. The eldest sister's hands were careful but confident, moving with precision while the two younger sisters giggled whenever they made mistakes. John laughed with them, not scolding but encouraging, and he felt a warmth in his chest as he watched them learn. It was more than just teaching. It was a bond growing stronger, built on patience, respect, and the quiet joy of shared work. But life in the desert was not without challenges. Brit. One afternoon, as they worked near the edge of the farm, John noticed dust rising in the distance. He squinted and saw a small group of men riding toward the farm. Brit. They were townspeople, curious and suspicious of the young girls who had been visiting him. John's heart sank. Brit. He knew that their innocent visits could easily be misunderstood, that people might see them as troublemakers or think John was doing something wrong. He waved frantically, trying to warn the sisters, but they froze, unsure what to do. Brit. Quickly, John guided them behind a cluster of rocks. He pointed to the approaching men and shook his head, showing that they should stay hidden. The sisters huddled together, their small hands gripping each other tightly. John could feel their fear, and he knew that he had to protect them without causing panic. Brit. He watched as the men rode past, their eyes scanning the farm but never noticing the hidden group. When the danger had passed, the sisters slowly emerged from behind the rocks. Brit. They touched John's hand lightly, a silent gesture of gratitude and trust.
The incident reminded John of the fragility of trust.
Brit. It could grow, flourish, and bring joy, but it could also be threatened by misunderstanding and fear. Brit. He resolved to be careful, to ensure that their friendship remained a safe space, protected from the world that might not understand it. The sisters seemed to understand this too, and they clung to the routine that made them feel secure. They would come each morning, laugh, learn, and share stories, and John would continue to guide them gently, fostering a sense of safety and belonging. Brit. One morning, the eldest sister arrived with a small bundle of dried herbs and flowers, carefully tied together with a thin strip of leather. She handed it to John with a shy smile, pointing to herself and then to him, clearly trying to communicate that it was a gift. Brit. John took the bundle with reverence, nodding and smiling, understanding the significance of the gesture. Gifts in their culture were not just objects. they were symbols of trust, respect, and affection. He placed the bundle carefully in his cabin, feeling honored that they had shared this part of their world with him. The sisters also began to open up more about their own lives. Through gestures and drawings in the dirt, they shared stories of their family, their home, and the small traditions that had shaped them. John listened intently, piecing together the meaning from their movements, the expressions on their faces, and the small artifacts they showed him. He learned that their parents had taught them to respect the land, to value knowledge passed down from their ancestors, and to be cautious of strangers. These lessons, though simple, were profound in their depth. John felt a growing admiration for their wisdom, realizing that the world he had sought to escape was richer and more intricate than he had imagined. As the weeks went by, the sisters' visits became a source of joy not just for John, but for the land itself. Their laughter seemed to echo through the fields, the wind carrying it across the plains. Birds would sometimes join in, chirping in response, and the desert, once silent and still, felt alive with movement and sound. John began to look forward to their arrival each day, counting the moments until they appeared on the ridge, waving and smiling. The sisters, in turn, began to anticipate their time with him, running toward the farm with energy and excitement, their faces glowing with happiness. John also learned to read their moods, the subtle shifts in expression and posture that told him when they were happy, curious, or cautious. He became more attuned to the rhythms of the desert, noticing the changes in wind, light, and temperature, understanding how these things affected the sisters and their comfort. In many ways, he felt as though he had become part of their world, even if only for a few hours each day. The boundaries that had once separated them, the differences in language, culture, and appearance were slowly dissolving, replaced by a shared understanding and mutual respect. Yet life was never without its lessons. One afternoon, while working together in the garden, one of the younger sisters accidentally knocked over a small stack of freshly planted seeds. She looked up at John, expecting anger or disappointment. Instead, he smiled and showed her how to carefully replant them. The relief and joy on her face was palpable, and John realized that trust and patience were not just abstract ideas. They were living, breathing qualities that could transform fear into confidence. This lesson, he knew, applied not just to farming, but to every interaction they had, every step of their growing friendship. By the end of Part 3, a deep bond had formed. The sisters and John had learned to communicate without words, to understand one another through gestures, smiles, and shared experiences. The farm had become a sanctuary, a place where two very different worlds could meet without fear or prejudice. And though the future remained uncertain, and though challenges would undoubtedly arise, the foundation of trust they had built was strong enough to carry them forward. The quiet rhythm of their mornings was soon interrupted by a shadow of tension that neither John nor the sisters could ignore. The bond they had built over weeks of shared work and laughter was strong, but the world outside the farm remained unpredictable. And sometimes curiosity and misunderstanding could turn into conflict. That morning began like any other, with the three sisters arriving along the bridge of the canyon, their faces bright and smiling. John greeted them with his usual wave and a basket of fresh vegetables he had picked from the field. But the air felt heavier than usual, as if the desert itself knew that change was coming. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a lost cow. John had been raising a small herd for milk and labor, and one of the cows had wandered near the canyon's edge. It was not unusual for the animals to stray, but the sisters were nearby when it happened. The cow startled them, and in the chaos a few of John's carefully planted crops were trampled. He felt a pang of frustration, though he kept it hidden, knowing that anger would not help. The sisters looked terrified, expecting him to shout or scold them. Instead, John took a deep breath and gestured for them to calm down. He pointed to the cow, then to the damaged crops, and finally to himself, showing that while he was upset, he would work to fix the problem rather than blame them. The sisters watched carefully, their hands touching his in small gestures of reassurance. But they understood his patience and began to help him gather the cow and assess the damage. That day, John realized that trust could be tested in the smallest ways, even by accidents, and that patience was as vital as any crop he had planted. Later that afternoon, John noticed the dust of horse hooves rising in the distance again. This time, it was not just townspeople. It was a group of men from the nearby settlement, led by a man whose expression was sharp and suspicious. They had heard rumors of strange visitors to John's farm, and the whispers of trespassing had reached their ears. John felt a wave of concern. He knew that the sisters' presence could be misunderstood. Some people might see them as trespassers or threats. The girls, sensing tension, clung to each other, their small hands gripping one another tightly. John motioned for them to follow him behind a row of rocks that bordered the field. He crouched beside them, whispering reassurances in the only way he could. Desperate. Through gestures and gentle touches, he showed them that everything would be all right if they stayed quiet and out of sight. The men approached the farm, their eyes scanning the area. John kept his own posture calm, hoping to appear as though nothing unusual was happening. After a tense moment, the men passed, grumbling to one another, and John breathed a sigh of relief. The sisters emerged slowly from their hiding place, their hands brushing his in gratitude and trust. This incident was a turning point. First, John understood that the world outside their small sanctuary could not be ignored. He had to protect the sisters while continuing to nurture the trust they had built. He realized that their bond was fragile, and that even small misunderstandings could threaten the connection they shared. From that day forward, he decided to be more cautious, keeping an eye on the horizon and preparing for anything that might endanger them. Despite the challenges, the sisters' visits continued, and their trust in John deepened. They began to share more personal stories, using drawings in the dirt and gestures to convey their experiences. They spoke of the animals they tended, the lessons their parents had taught them, and the small traditions of their tribe. John listened intently, marveling at their resilience and wisdom. He learned that their world, though different from his own, was rich with knowledge, creativity, and a profound understanding of the land. One day, John decided to show the sisters a hidden corner of his farm that he rarely visited. It was a small orchard he had planted years before, where the trees were just beginning to bear fruit. Desperate, he led them carefully through the rows, pointing out the ripest apples and pears. The sisters gasped in delight, their hands reaching out to touch the smooth skin of the fruit. John watched as they examined each tree with wonder, noticing how they instinctively understood the care required to grow something so delicate in a harsh environment. He realized that this shared experience was teaching them, and teaching him, the importance of patience, observation, and respect for life. However, the peace was not to last. A misunderstanding soon arose between John and the sisters, one that tested the limits of their trust. One of the younger sisters accidentally broke a small basket John had been using to carry seeds. She froze, expecting a reprimand, but John's first instinct was not anger. He knelt beside her, showing her how to repair it using simple techniques. The act was more than fixing a basket. It was a lesson in compassion and understanding. The sisters learned that mistakes did not always lead to punishment, and John learned that patience and guidance could turn fear into confidence. Tension also arose from cultural differences. The sisters had traditions that John did not fully understand, and sometimes his actions unintentionally conflicted with their customs. For example, one afternoon John had planted flowers near the edge of the field, not realizing that the area was considered sacred by the sisters. When they approached, their expressions changed, and through gestures and urgent whispers they communicated that he had unknowingly crossed a boundary. John listened carefully, realizing the importance of respecting their beliefs. He carefully moved the flowers to another spot, showing his willingness to honor their traditions. This moment deepened their respect for him, and he, in turn, gained a new appreciation for their wisdom. Despite the obstacles, there were moments of pure joy. One day, after a morning of work, the sisters led John to a hidden stream in the canyon. The water was clear and cool, running gently over smooth stones. They played in the water, laughing and splashing, their voices echoing through the canyon. John joined them, feeling the joy of the moment ripple through him. In those carefree hours, all the challenges of the outside world seemed distant, replaced by a shared sense of wonder and delight. The trust they had built allowed them to experience freedom together, if only for a few hours each day. The lessons of Part 4 were clear. Trust must be nurtured, patience must be constant, and understanding must overcome fear. John and the sisters had faced small but meaningful challenges, and each one had strengthened their connection. They had learned to navigate misunderstandings, to respect each other's worlds, and to protect one another in the face of outside threats. Their bond was no longer fragile. It was resilient, built on shared experiences, respect, and the quiet strength of mutual care. As the sun dipped below the horizon one evening, painting the sky with shades of pink and orange, John and the sisters sat together on a small hill overlooking the farm. The sisters touched his hands lightly, a gesture that had become their silent way of expressing trust and affection. John smiled, feeling the weight of the day lift from his shoulders. He knew that challenges would continue to arise, that misunderstandings might test their bond again, but he also knew that what they had built was strong enough to endure. He looked at the sisters and realized that the trust they had given him was a gift far greater than any crop or harvest. It was a bridge between worlds, a connection that transcended language, culture, and fear. And in that moment, John felt a quiet sense of hope. They had faced difficulties, yes, but they had also grown together. Their bond was no longer just a matter of curiosity or kindness. It was a relationship forged in understanding, patience, and shared experience. As night fell and the first stars appeared in the sky, John walked the sisters back toward the canyon, making sure they reached the edge safely. They paused one last time, each of them touching his hands in a gentle farewell. John watched them disappear into the shadows, knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of learning, laughter, and perhaps new challenges. But he was ready. They were ready. And together they had discovered that trust, once earned, could carry them through even the most uncertain moments. Part 4 closed with a quiet understanding. The world outside their small sanctuary was unpredictable and sometimes dangerous, but the bond they shared was powerful. They had learned that trust could be tested without being broken, that patience could overcome fear, and that understanding could bridge the gaps between very different lives. John and the sisters had grown together, and though the journey was far from over, they faced the future with confidence, hope, and a deep respect for one another. The days of quiet mornings and shared laughter on the farm were approaching a turning point. John had known from the start that the time with the three sisters would be temporary. Their world, shaped by family and traditions, could not be replaced by his farm or his small cabin. Yet, neither he nor the sisters had expected just how strong their bond had grown. Each visit had deepened trust, respect, and understanding. Each shared meal, gesture, and laugh had bridged the gap between worlds that, on the surface, seemed impossible to cross. Disparate. One morning, the eldest sister arrived first, carrying a small bundle of dried flowers and herbs. Her eyes were bright, but there was a subtle seriousness in her expression that John had not seen before. The younger sisters followed shortly after, their smiles hesitant, unsure. John sensed that something had shifted. They were trying to communicate something important, But words alone would not be enough. The eldest sister gestured toward the horizon, then back at him. Brit. John understood at once. It was time for them to leave, perhaps to return to their family, or to follow a path he could not walk with them. The news brought a quiet heaviness to John's heart. Brit. He had grown used to the rhythm of their days, to the gentle joy of their presence, to the lessons they had shared with him and the lessons he had shared in return. The farm, once a place of solitude, had become alive with life, laughter, and discovery. He tried to show calmness, to smile and gesture that he understood, but inside he felt a deep sadness. The sisters, sensing his feelings, reached for his hands.
Brit. Their touch, gentle and reassuring, was a silent way of saying that their bond would not be broken even by distance.
Over the next few days, they spent every moment together, savoring the last visits.
Brit. John took them to every corner of the farm he had shared with them. The orchard with its ripening fruit, the vegetable patch where they had planted together, and the small grove of trees he had planted near the cabin. Brit. The sisters explored each place with awe, remembering the work and joy they had shared there. John demonstrated again how to care for the plants, hoping to leave them with skills that would serve them beyond his farm. The sisters listened, imitating him, laughing, and asking questions through gestures. Each day was bittersweet, filled with joy and the quiet knowledge that their time together was ending. Desperate. One afternoon they arrived early and guided John to a hidden area near the canyon, a place where the desert seemed untouched by human hands. There was a small stream running through the rocks, the water clear and sparkling. Brit. The sisters pointed to the water, then to themselves, then back at John. They wanted him to understand that this place, sacred and familiar to them, was part of their farewell. Brit. They played near the stream, their laughter echoing across the canyon. But there was a softness now, a quiet awareness that this would be their last visit here for a while.
John joined them, letting the water run over his hands, feeling the coolness and purity of the moment.
Brit. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, the sisters brought John small gifts. The eldest had a simple clay bowl. The younger ones had decorated stones and feathers. Brit. Each gift carried meaning, respect, trust, memory, and connection. John accepted each one with reverence, knowing that these objects were more than tokens. They were symbols of a bond that had transcended language, culture, and fear. Brit. He placed them carefully in his cabin, a reminder of the sisters and the lessons they had taught him. Before they left, the eldest sister reached out to touch John's hands. Brit. Then, softly, she whispered words in their language. Though he could not understand them, the tone was filled with gratitude, love, and farewell. The younger sisters followed, pressing their small hands against his in turn. John felt a swell of emotion, realizing that the touch that had begun weeks before, the touch that had marked the first meeting, was now a symbol of a lasting connection. But he knelt and placed his hands over theirs, holding the moment gently, silently promising to remember them always. The departure itself was slow, deliberate, and full of emotion. John watched as they walked back toward the canyon, their figures growing smaller with each step. He waved continuously, unable to speak through the tears that had formed in his eyes. Bert. The sisters turned back one last time, their hands raised in a final gesture of connection. And then they disappeared into the shadows of the canyon, leaving John standing alone in the quiet desert. Brit. That night, John sat by the small fire near his cabin, staring at the stars above. The memory of their laughter, their curiosity, and their gentle trust filled his mind. Brit. He thought about the lessons he had learned: patience, respect, empathy, and the power of understanding beyond words. The farm, once quiet and lonely, had become a place of growth, not just for crops, but for hearts and minds. Bert. He realized that his life had been changed forever by the presence of 3 young sisters from a world he had only just begun to understand. In the days that followed, John maintained his routine on the farm, tending to his crops and animals, but the echoes of the sisters' visits remained with him, visible in the small touches they had left behind. The clay bowl, the decorated stones, the footprints near the stream, and the memories etched into his mind. He planted a small grove of trees at the spot where they had first met, a living tribute to the bond they had shared. Each tree was a reminder that even fleeting connections could grow strong roots in the heart. As weeks turned into months, John occasionally saw signs that the sisters were nearby. He glimpsed movement along the canyon ridge, heard distant laughter, or found small gifts left for him near the farm. Though they no longer visited every day, the connection endured, a quiet thread linking two worlds. John felt a profound sense of gratitude for the trust and friendship they had shared. He understood that life was full of moments like this, brief yet transformative, fleeting yet eternal in memory. The experience also left John with a deeper understanding of the world around him. He saw that kindness and respect could bridge even the widest divides. He learned that trust, once given, could carry people through fear, misunderstanding, and distance. And, most importantly, he realized that human connection, simple, honest, and heartfelt, was one of the greatest treasures life could offer. Sisters had touched his life in ways no words could capture, and he knew that their presence had made him a better person, more patient, more observant, and more open to the unexpected wonders of life. Years later, John would often walk among the grove of trees he had planted in memory of the sisters. He would think back to the first day he had seen them, to the moment when one hand touched his, and to the quiet, patient friendship that had blossomed afterward. The desert, once silent and lonely, had become a place of stories, memories, and living connection. The bond he had formed with the sisters endured in every corner of the farm, in every plant, in every whisper of the wind. And though the sisters had long since returned to their family and their own lives, John carried them with him always. The memory of their trust, laughter, and gentle wisdom became a guiding light, reminding him of the beauty that could be found in reaching out to others, in crossing boundaries, and in believing in the power of simple human connection. In the quiet of the desert night, John would sometimes whisper their names into the wind, imagining that somewhere the sisters smiled, remembering him too. In the end, the story was not just about a farmer and three young sisters. It was about courage, empathy, and the quiet, transformative power of trust. It was about two worlds meeting and discovering that despite differences in language, culture, or appearance, hearts could find one another. John had learned that friendship could flourish in the most unlikely places, that moments of connection could leave lasting imprints, and that the smallest gestures, touches, smiles, and shared work could create memories that would endure for a lifetime. And so the farm continued to thrive under John's care, the trees he planted standing tall as symbols of hope, trust, and lasting friendship. The desert, once a place of solitude, had become a living testament to the bond between him and the three sisters. Their story, though simple, was profound. A reminder that human connection, built with patience, respect, and kindness, could transcend worlds, endure challenges, and leave a legacy far greater than anything measured by time or distance.